So the youth sectors are different state by state, meaning what happens in South Australia is different from what happens in New South Wales, which is different from what happens in Victoria. They all use a pretty similar model, but in terms of how they're governed, South Australia can govern their youth sector uh, however they want in defiance, if they want to, of what Victoria are doing. So, it's interesting how whether that plays out, but say we know that South Australians don't get paid as much as the people do in Queensland. So the minimum pay wage in South Australia is different to being in Queensland, for example. Um, so I've tried to give like a bit of I'm going to try and give a bit of a breakdown about how the government and the non-government sector engage and work in collaboration and in partnership and the unique a relationship that it has. So basically, we have a minister for youth. Isn't We have a minister for youth, and it's his job to oversee government strategies seeking to support young people in South Australia. So we have public servants, and so public servants work in the government, and they're government employees working for young people. Now, the Office for Youth is the peak body for government youth affairs in South Australia. Now, so when whatever government comes into power, they get allocated a certain amount of money, and that certain amount of money they can care for young people. And then so they have to set up various government programs to be able to cater for young people. And the people that fill those roles working for the government are public servants. Now, that's kind of like really briefly the government. Now, there's also how the non-government comes into play. Now, it's very, very unique to ever have the non-government organisations such as Anglicare, such as Baptist Care, such as Uniting Communities being totally impartial from the government. What basically happens is that for a non-government organisation to be able to care for clients is that they need to get funding from somewhere. And that funding normally comes from the government. And the way that happens is that a service like an organisation such as Anglicare will come up with this amazing new strategy. And what the government will do, well, they'll take a bunch of their money, and instead of running their programs themselves, they'll employ Anglicare to run that service on their behalf. And then so, say for example, in South Australia we have a FLOW program, which is an alternative education program for over 1,000 young people in South Australia. Now, instead of the government actually funding case managers to look after those young people, what happens is that there's various different youth services such as Anglicare, such as Baptist Care, such as Uniting Communities, that will then go and do all that work for the government, and because they have got money funded through the Department of Education, which is a government department that then funds non-for-profit organisations to work on their behalf. So you've got non-government, the Youth Affairs Council of South Australia, which is called YACSA. That's the non-government peak affairs body. Now they constantly work in relationship with each other, and there's community service organisations obviously fit as a part of non-government. Now they work in relationship with each other, but there are various reasons why you may want to work for non-government and you may want to work for government. For example, a pro of working in government is that if you work in government, you'll get paid at a higher wage, and you've got a greater chance of longevity in that role. The reason being is that they're not grant funded, and then so they're getting ongoing financial support from government because they're the government in power. And then so if you've acquired a permanent government position and they decide to shift funding from your program and put it somewhere else, you'll still have a job. They'll just move you to a different department, or you'll just sit at home and wait for something to come up and they'll keep paying you. Now, in non-government, you're generally on year-long contracts, and it'll always say subject to funding, subject to funding, subject to funding. And then so any time throughout the year, if funding gets pulled, you can lose your job. Now, it's very rarely that funding will get pulled halfway through the year. Generally, government, like assistant, commits to ongoing to annual refunding of programs, and it'll be your manager's job to find out whether that money's coming through or not, and give all the staff enough time to know if they've still got jobs. But in terms of financial viability, government definitely have a leg up. Now, the reason why you'd want to go to non-government, because everyone's now screaming, "Oh, better go work for government." The reason why you go work for non-government is because they get to be entrepreneurs. They get to do exciting programs. They get to do unique programs. They get to come up with great and fantastic new ideas. But government workers don't get to do that, because governments have a pool of money allocated to, say, juvenile justice, to alternative education, to things like that, and they've got a pool of money that's allocated to grants. And then so non-government organisations will put out this new, interesting, exciting model that they're working on, and the governments can choose to fund that. And so in non-government, you've got a lot more free rein to come up with new ideas, or to change the policies of your organisation, or to change the service structure, or to run a new program, where government don't really have that freedom. Government are very much locked into the way that they do things. They're very much in a lot of ways don't get to be as creative as non-government, purely based on a funding model and funding policies. So government's got its pros, and non-government has got its pros. And so I'd encourage you that when you're visiting different youth services, visit both, and just say to them, what do you feel like is the plus of working in a non-government organisation? And say, what is the plus of working in a government organisation? And then ask the pros and cons of both of those.